This is an extremely important series that looks at the Jewish sages from a uniquely Netzarim perspective, that is, those who walk in accordance with the original sect of the Nazarene Jews and their converts. Rebbe Yeshua HaNotzri instructed his students to do everything that the scribes and the Pharisees teach them, and that each student should seek to attain righteousness that exceeds theirs. With this mandate in mind, it is every Notzri's obligation to familiarize themselves with not only Yeshua's teachings, but the teachings of other great pious men that came before and after him. So sit back as we make our way through highlights of the great Torah sages. The Vilna Gaon. Elijah ben Shlomo Kramer was a Lithuanian Talmudist, Kabbalist, grammarian and mathematician who was born in 1720 and lived till 1797. He earned the title the Gaon, meaning genius, because of his phenomenal knowledge of and devotion to the Torah. Also known as the Gra, an acronym for Gaon Rabbi Eliyahu, the Vilna Gaon was born and grew up in Vilna, now known as Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. He was one of the most standout sages of his time, and as his title mentions, he was the pride of the people of Vilna. All images we have of the Vilna Gaon are guesswork. Posing for a portrait would have been completely unacceptable to a man that spent very little of his adult life outside the four walls of his humble dwelling. Before I go any further, please also watch the lecture of the Vilna Gaon by Dr. Henry Abramson, which is amazing. If this series does nothing more than funnel people to this man's lectures on the sages, I'm happy. But nevertheless, I do try to mention some things Dr. Abramson simply had no time to cover in the time allotted to him for his lectures. Besides the published writings and observations produced by his students, there would actually be no solid record of his existence at all outside some 18th century population censuses, which show nothing more than a first and last name. This is not at all that long ago in comparison to Rebbe Yeshua, of whom there are also scant secular records outside Josephus. So if one wanted to question the existence of Yeshua based on scant sources outside those with a supposedly religious agenda, then the Vilna Gaon, who existed 1,700 years later, would also be called into question, notwithstanding the existence of his numerous children, of course. At age 7, he gave his first public discourse, and he displayed a fully developed intellect, and by the time he was 10, he had advanced to the point where he no longer needed a teacher. Again, we can see another comparison here with Rebbe Yeshua, astounding the elders of Yerushalayim at age 12, and his wisdom outmatching the heavyweights of his day. When he reached a more mature age, the Vilna Gaon showed exceptional traits in modesty and asceticism, which took the form of him wandering about in various parts of Poland and Germany, disguised as a beggar, until he could no longer remain hidden and eventually returned to Vilna in 1748. This is significant because in Judaism, Tzaddikim, that is righteous ones, would deliberately take on professions that enabled them to move about communities and interact with people incognito. These were called Tzaddikim Nistarim, which means hidden righteous ones. They would usually stay concealed as long as they could, elevating and supporting individuals and a community in a way that could avoid them receiving any type of praise or esteem. We see the same thing with Rebbe Yeshua working for his father Yosef for the majority of his life until coming out of hiding, initially at the coaxing of his mother at a wedding in Hana. The Vilna Gaon held no official rabbinical position, he headed no yeshiva or formal school throughout his entire life, and he never published any works in his lifetime. His view was that only the Torah should be written, and the oral Torah should remain in its oral form unless circumstances require. As such, his students acquired all his writings and they began publishing them after he passed. On a journey to Israel, which didn't eventuate, getting as far as Germany, he did write a letter which is more of a will and testament in case he didn't survive the journey. Traveling back then was quite dangerous. And this letter became known as the Igrat Hagra, which means the letter of the Vilna Gaon, subtitled in some works as the Letter for the Ages, and is available in various formats and published through different companies with commentaries from other rabbis. And this work serves as a very critical part of learning Jewish ethics. Most of this man's lifetime was spent literally immersed in Torah study. He was completely and utterly devoted to it, to the point that it was an area of criticism by some rabbanim. He slept 4 hours a day in half-hour shifts, 3 of them at night and 1 of them during the day. His son gives us the following account of his sleep schedule. For 50 years my father did not sleep more than half an hour at a time, and not more than 2 hours during an entire day. So as not to fall asleep during the winter nights, he studied in a house that was not heated, with his feet immersed in cold water. He never went 2 yards without Torah or tefillin, that is the prayer phylacteries, and he never had a useless conversation in his entire life. Before his death, while crying abundantly, he confessed to having sinned in losing 4 minutes of Torah study. End of quote. He never sought to make a name for himself, but his knowledge was so great and sought after that the city of Vilna paid him a small monthly stipend. The community viewed him as a leader, despite his aversion to this role in any official capacity. An example of his kindness and piety is probably best illustrated in a story of an individual who was responsible for delivering his money and who would take this money for himself. The Gaon, who eventually realized what was happening, never accused him of doing this nor told anyone of it because he did not want to shame the person responsible. Indeed, we would not even know of this incident if the guilty person had not confessed it on his deathbed. Despite his personal poverty, the Gaon always gave 20% of his income to charity. Despite his constant diligence in learning, he always kept an ear out for people in need and was known to interrupt his studies in order to meet with relatives of a person in need to convince them to help their relative out. He also kept a diary of any moment of wasted time that was not filled with direct Torah study or doing mitzvot, and it is estimated that he accrued a total of 3 hours per year, of which he wept over profusely. The Gaon was a leading opponent of Chassidus, a movement founded by Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov in the 1730s. The Hasidim instituted a number of changes in standard Jewish practice, and many great leaders viewed them as a breakaway sect from true Judaism in the manner of similar movements in the past. In a sense, this movement came under some of the same criticisms as the ancient Netzarim sect of the Jews that emerged after the time of Rebbe Yeshua. Hasidim gave birth to the Chabad, which is an acronym of Chokmah, which is wisdom, Binah, which is understanding, and Da'at, which is knowledge. This all emphasizes a focus on service of the heart, prayer, and righteousness, with less emphasis on intellectualism, Torah study, and scholarship. And this emphasis was particularly worrisome in this regard. Chassidus also placed a very strong emphasis on fervent worship. While this is well within the boundaries of traditional Judaism, many of the opponents of the Chassidus, called the Misnagdim, misunderstood this emphasis as detracting from the importance of Torah study. Despite the Gaon's opposition to Chassidus, he was widely recognized by all groups as a leading Torah authority of his time. Indeed, when after the Gaon's passing, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, one of the most prominent leaders of the group at the time, issued a public letter forbidding any negative statements to be uttered, but rather required his followers to speak of the greatness of the Gaon. Hey, before you go, if you like this series and you want to find out much more, check out our books, All Lights On in the Master's House, Lightning from the Master's House, Flying Chariot, Fallen Dragon, and Is Alcoholic. All available on Amazon.com and other online bookstores, and help us to continue to spread the word. Also check out our website, netzrimantasee.com, where we have many teachings and resources on a myriad of subjects that will enlighten and enhance your walk. Bye for now.